All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Dave Holstrom. It's June 20th, 2024. We're at Dave's home in Gearhart, and thank you so much for joining us today, Dave.
My pleasure.
First question, as you know, is why wine?
Well, that's a good question. Why not? I don't know. I guess I've always been, I say always, but I think ever since college, started getting interested in wine for a lot of different reasons. I love food. Early exposure to wine, a lot of the stuff was kind of iffy. A lot of bum wines, Ripple and MD 2020 and stuff like that. That was the earliest exposure I had. But what happened is I got more into the food end of the business and restaurant management, and got to taste more and more wine. Wine sort of appealed to me because of everything else that it led to. Mm-hmm. So, I was a history major and was always really interested in geography. And wine brings all that together. There's the history of wine, there's the history of food, there's the geography, and the wine tastes like this over here, and the same grape over here, maybe a mile away, tastes completely different. Wine is so expressive on so many different levels. It's not only an expression of where it's produced, but I think in the best examples, it's an expression of who's producing it, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes with a really good producer, and you get to meet that person, it's pretty clear sometimes that it is an expression of that person as well. Mm. And then wine is appealing too because of to carry on from that, of who I've met in this industry. And you just, I can't think of too many people that just haven't been fantastic to work with or deal with. Mm-hmm. And so that's it, I guess. I don't think it's anything different than anyone else that sort of falls into it. Most of the people I know in the business sort of fell into it. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that's good or bad.
It draws you in one way or another. Well, let's talk about life before wine then. Tell us about where you were born and raised and kind of path into college. Well,
I was born in Chicago and raised in Chicago until I was 18. And we lived right in the city there, and I did a lot. It was fun. I went to a private high school there, and then after graduating from high school, I went to college. Started out at a small college in Western Michigan, and then transferred over to Michigan, and studied history, in particular Russian history, which really didn't help very much with the wine industry. And did a lot of my summers we had a little place in a place called Saugatuck, Michigan, that was on Lake Michigan, and would spend my summers there doing a lot of fishing and stuff like that. And then also my mom and dad retired up to Door County, Wisconsin, which is that peninsula that forms Green Bay, cherries, and spent a lot of time up there too. Loved it up there. After graduating from college, I went on to move to Washington, D.C. and graduate school at George Washington, and studied a really helpful subject, 19th century Russian intellectual history, thinking that I really wanted to be in the academic world and whatever, and finished that up. Loved living in Washington. It was a little bit hot in the summertime and whatever, but loved Washington, D.C. Lived on Capitol Hill. It was 3rd and Pennsylvania Southeast, so right across really from the Library of Congress. Mm-hmm. And I remember when you could still walk up to the Capitol and you could back then, because this would have been like, what, 1975 or something like that. I remember having snowball fights with people, right, you know, on what is actually the front of the Capitol. What we usually see is the back. But yeah, so that was great. And the Eastern market was there, so it was a big, you know, an early form of farmers market type thing. It was great. So after finishing up there, I had come to the conclusion that I really didn't want to be in the academic world. It seemed like everybody that I met wanted to be a lawyer. And I just didn't feel, I wasn't happy at all. Mm-hmm. So my girlfriend at the time and I decided that it would be a really good idea to move up to Maine. And we drove up and down the Maine coast a couple of times and decided on what I still think is probably the prettiest town in Maine, in Camden. And rented a place, next door to that in Rockport. And I mean, it was absolutely beautiful. The place was across from, in Rockport, was right across from, he was the only lobsterman in that little bay. And he had all of his tanks and everything underneath his house. And he would sell me all the culls, you know, that had lost an arm for like next to nothing, you know. So it was like heaven. And if a person could have made a living up there at any point, I'd probably still be living up there, but you couldn't. I loved the people because, you know, the New Englanders, and you get the same thing, but a little different feel to it when I lived down south. That ability to sum things up in a sentence. And I wish I had that ability, but to sum it up in a sentence and have it be sort of wry and funny. And, you know, everybody weighed 90 pounds and like a rail. It was great. So the only job I could get, this was, we were struggling. The only job that I could get was as a breakfast cook. And I should have said that I got into the restaurant industry in college by waiting tables. And so I had a little bit of experience. I'd always, you know, growing up, always helped my mom cooking and stuff. Cooking has always been something I really love to do. And there was a Swiss chef there that hired me, and I think he was desperate for somebody. That could be the only reason that he would have hired me, was because he was desperate. And here you go, you know. So I was cooking at this place called the Camden Manor Inn, and did breakfast. And he ended up teaching me quite a bit, let me do a lot more, I think, than he originally intended, because I was desperate for money and was willing to show up, you know. So worked there, and then worked at the Whitehall Inn, which is kind of a famous little place in Camden. Has always been, you know, sort of a celebrity-driven thing. Mm-hmm. And worked there for a little while. Actually went back and waited tables there. So about that time, I ended up, we decided that as much as we loved Maine, that wasn't going to work out. Mm-hmm. Moved down to Connecticut, and I got a job, and actually the chef helped me, got a job in, not New Haven, but right next to it, right just outside of Westport. And he was a German guy. And I essentially cut vegetables for him for a while as a prep cook. And did a little bit of line cooking for him. And while I was there, there were these guys that used to come in for dinner that would always stop and talk to me when I would be on the line. And they were really, really nice. They seemed really smart, always asked a lot of questions. And I found out that they worked for a company called the Chart House. And at one point, one of the guys asked me, you should think about coming and working for us. Well, I had hair down to here. I had the full-on beard, the whole deal. And the chart house was all, surfer types with the short haircuts, and they were all athletes and whatever. And I don't know, I guess they liked some of the food that I did. But I ended up applying to the chart house into management. And at the time, I think the chart house had maybe 16 restaurants. This is about 1977. And I just realized I left out a big chunk of something that actually influenced the wine part of this. But I can go back and cover it. So I ended up applying to the chart house. They had 16 or 17 restaurants. They used to hire all their management from within. They never hired people from outside of the company. They wanted to expand. And at that time, I think they had maybe 4 restaurants or 3 restaurants on the East Coast, one in Chester, Connecticut, and in New Haven, one in Boston, and one in Newport, Rhode Island. And so I applied and, went with my long hair and beard and had this great interview with this guy in New Haven, Bob Wien. And the restaurants were always beautiful. They were always much better at real estate and decor than and at customer service than anything with food. But just a great company, almost a cult, but just wonderful people to talk with. And they hired me. And I was the second person that they hired from outside the company. Before I go on with the chart house, I left out a really important part of this whole thing. And that was in graduate school. I spent a lot of time in Europe, in Central and Eastern Europe. And in Sarajevo, in the old Yugoslavia. And got to go to Russia, or Soviet Union, Sovietsky Soyuz. And spent a lot of time there, spent about 9 months in Yugoslavia, which is a whole nother story and whatever. But I used to take the ferry over to Italy and down to southern Italy, and ended up with a couple of friends of mine, and we just traveled all over, and we drank wine like we had discovered it, and had a tremendous amount of exposure to Italian wine. And we got up as far as Austria and southern Germany, and then over into eastern France and southeast France, and then back. And we did that a number of times. And that was the first real exposure to really good wine. When I was in college, in undergraduate school, there was, the drinking age in Michigan at that time was 19. This is before we rediscovered our Puritan roots. And there was what we would have thought of, or what we would think now of as a precursor to 7-Eleven. Mm-hmm. But these guys had every SKU of Christian Brothers wine. So there were like probably 20 different varieties that they had. And wine was cheap. And I later grew to love it and got involved with it because I ended up doing a lot of beer programs. But, for me, and probably even still today, 2 beers, that's about it. I'm ready for the next thing, But wine, I could keep doing this. And so I tasted through that whole range 2 or 3 times. And what I discovered, and I probably shouldn't say this out loud, but what I discovered is that in college that the women actually kind of preferred wine, and so instead of like beer, and so it was I became more interesting, I think, you know. So it was that was a big boost for me. Anyway, back to the chart house. Went out and did their training program. This is in early 1977, and I think the chart house gave us a really good how to run a business education, how to make a restaurant profitable, and what is essential to make a restaurant successful besides just consistently good food, and that it is about your customer and taking care of that person and trying to do the right thing, treating people, and that was actually one of the main, you know, the golden rule was one of the main things for the company, was to treat people the way that you wanted to be treated. And it is amazing today that is still really, really relevant, and how rarely you run into it. So the Chart House was a good company to work for. It was, for me, it was a little bit, as I was with them from 77 to 85, and I started as an assistant manager and became a general manager, regional manager, a regional training manager, and finally I ended up being the recruiter for management for the East Coast. And the East Coast was from Denver, Colorado to the Virgin Islands. That was my territory. So I visited a lot of colleges and stuff like that. So the Chart House is really important for my development, not so much on the food end. I mean, it was just a steakhouse. But definitely, I think for customer service, how to run a business, it was an opportunity to live in fantastic cities and parts of the country all over. I think I've lived in like 22 states. You know, and then the Virgin Islands, I was the regional manager down there for a while, and Puerto Rico, places like that. Just unforgettable experiences that I never would have been able to do had I not worked for a company like that.
Tell me about you mentioned kind of the golden rule. Other sort of lessons you developed there, that things you took with you from that experience.
I think that one of the main things was, and it's actually much simpler than this, but the one of the main things was doing the same thing, and this is really from a manage your building, manage your inventory and stuff like that. Doing the same thing every day, following up every day. You have your checklists. You check the stuff off, and you don't leave things to memory. Mm-hmm. You follow through every day. That was very important. Really trying to develop, with treating people the way that you want to be treated, that with purveyors, with suppliers, you do that same thing, and that you're upfront. You always pay your bills on time. You pay them early if you can. You don't necessarily, I mean, within reason, just because you can save 5 cents on something over here is not a good enough reason to switch your partner, mm-hmm. because your partner is going to be, that long-term relationship most times is going to be more important and more effective and more profitable in the long run. So I could tell you chart house stories, but I won't do that, because then you would really have to edit pretty heavily. But it was a fun company back then. It grew when I started. There were, I think I said 16 or 17 restaurants. When I left, we had 61. So there was a lot of expansion. There was one company that we merged into. There were a bunch of iterations of, Burger King owning it at one point, and then bought itself back, and it went back and forth a number of times. But it was also and I don't want to be real negative on it, because my chart house experience was pretty positive. But there was a lot of getting the most out of your managers for the least amount of money that you could. And there was, until you got up to a regional manager level or something like that, it was pretty rough. When you were assistant manager, there was not much money in the deal, and there was a work ethic that could be carried to the extreme. And I remember when I was first married to my first wife, I remember we were on our honeymoon. We were on our honeymoon, and I got a call from the president of the company. Why am I telling this story? Saying that, Dave, we really need you to, because they were going to move me to be the regional manager for these restaurants that we had opened in the South, in Charleston, in Savannah, in Jacksonville, Florida, and Miami. And we were excited because my first wife was from Charleston, and we were ready to move Charleston. And he said, we really need you to come back to San Diego, and we want you to go back and work with Bob Wien, the training guy, and do that. And so naturally I did that. But there was you had so many days vacation and things like that taking a week off is okay, don't take two, that sort of thing. And that got old after a while. On the good side, loved living in Boston, Massachusetts. That, when I first was in the company, that was the busiest restaurant in the company. Dinner only, the oldest commercial building in Boston. John Hancock had an office in it, just beautifully preserved by the company. And hurricanes went through the big snowstorm of '78. That it was just amazing experiences there. And then they asked me to manage the restaurant in New York. And this was a beautiful building down on the Hudson River, right across from the Palisades. And so you had the New York City skyline to the south, Tappan Zee Bridge to the north, all this river traffic back and forth. It's absolutely beautiful. And lots of good stories from that too. With, I think I picked up more .25 caliber guns off the floor that people had dropped during dinner than I've ever seen in my life. So anyway, I got to live in all these great places for the chart house. But by 1985, I was ready to move on. And we moved, at that point, we were living in Annapolis, Maryland, and we moved down to Williamsburg, Virginia. And I got a job at first, for a very short term, because I think I hated it and they hated me, with Phillips Seafood Company, and I was running their slowest restaurants in Norfolk, Virginia, $8 million a year. And I don't think I even stayed a year with that company. And ended up working for a short time with Colonial Williamsburg, and worked at the Williamsburg Lodge and the Williamsburg Inn. And again, in restaurant management. But I was able to be the beverage manager at the restaurants. And so I got to work with the wine program quite a bit, but it was they were good wine programs, but boy, it was really difficult to make a change or anything, because you had to go through so many people to say, okay, you can do that. And you had to have all your ducks in a row, and this is why we're doing this. And I enjoyed working for Colonial. We had a house in the historic district, so no cars, no electric lights out in the actual district. There were some great restaurants. The Trellis was a famous restaurant there. Marcel Dusaulnier was the chef, and he just passed away just a couple months ago. Death by Chocolate, he came up with that, and he was great. He was really, that was a great restaurant with just a tremendous short wine list. They probably had 100 selections, but the guy that was doing it, he was really, really good, and not expensive, So that was great, and then I got this job after a year. So I got a job with the Ford's Colony Country Club, which was a 36. Well, they had, I guess when I started, they had just 18 holes, and then they opened up another 18, and they were going to open up another one. It was also a development, very wealthy community, very expensive. And I got hired by John Blazon. I don't know if you know that name. He's a master sommelier, young guy at the time. And he wasn't an MS at that point. But this was just a beautiful, beautiful country club. And I was running a formal restaurant, 22 tables, members only, and full-on formal service, the whole thing. You've got spoons from here to here and forks from there to there, and front waiter, back waiter, totally silent, a beautiful, beautiful place, and a lot of fun, and had great dinners there because you had whatever was left over from the chefs, and there was a dinner every night with these guys, and wine, but working with John was amazing. He had put together just I don't know, there were probably close to 1,000 selections, pretty equally divided between domestic and imported wine. Great vintages, names that if we combined all of our incomes, we probably could afford a half bottle of something. And we did all kinds of wine dinners there, very formal, and John and I would sit and we would match these foods up with the chef, and I think we had a couple of Oregon guys. We had Dick Ponzi came out and did a dinner with us, and I remember sitting down in the wine cellar, which was beautifully, everything was just beautiful, surrounded by bottles, and with Dick Ponzi, and John and I and Dick, I think, drank till about 3 o'clock in the morning. It was all very intellectual discussion down there. And Dick Gearhart came out too and did a dinner with us, and that was a lot of fun. I learned to really hate golf because it was something that I absolutely had no talent for. So I worked with John for I think about 2 years, and then my wife and I got separated, split up. I moved up to Rhode Island because the Chart House was opening a restaurant there, and it was an easy way to maintain an income, whatever. So they were opening a restaurant in Warwick, Rhode Island, and I helped open that, and stuck with them not for very long. The regional manager up there really did me a favor to get me transported. I thought I would never leave Williamsburg. I loved Williamsburg. And so I was, not for very long, back with the Chart House. I realized I can't go back and do this. And I got a job in Providence, a real life-changing job in Providence with a young chef. I think he was in his late 30s at the time, Fabrizio Iannucci. And he was from Sardinia. And he had 2 small restaurants, one in Providence and one out in Johnston, Rhode Island. And they were really highly acclaimed. And this guy was fantastic. He was great as a chef. And I got to work his wine programs and manage Pizzico was the name of the one. Had nothing to do with pizza, didn't offer pizza, but Pizzico was the one. Il Piccolo was the other. And I was just looking at old menus that I had from there, and I was thinking, man, I could eat some of that. He was just really, really good. And we had a great wine list, probably about 200 selections, all Italian. And that was where I really, working that and being in an Italian restaurant was really life-changing for me, because up until that point, I think I thought, oh, Italian wine, yeah, it's okay. Mm-hmm. But it's never going to reach the heights of something from France or something like that. And then one day, somebody sent back a bottle of, and this was the first life-changing wine I ever had. And it was a 1985 Giacomo Bologna Bricco della Uccellone, so Barbera d'Asti. And I remember tasting it, and I think it had been open for an hour or so or whatever. And I remember tasting it, and I'm not exaggerating. I remember I stopped. I mean, it was like, what is this? You know, it was that sort of experience. You know, I get goosebumps just thinking about it, because it was so good. I mean, it was just like, Barbera, really? And you know, in Barrique, yeah, really? Okay. And it was like, and I couldn't believe it. And I think what happened was I realized that I had this mindset about Italian wine that was in the way of what was actually going on in the wine and with me. And at that point, you know, I just kind of went crazy with Italian wine. We were just all these great producers, and everything was still affordable at that point. You know, you could get great Barolos and great Barbarescos and whatever. You know, you could get unbelievable, you know, Pertamali, Montalcino, and it would be like $40 wholesale or something like that. You could get Gaia. You know, I mean, Gaia, I remember we had it on the list. I think it was like around $100. And I mean, it was expensive at the time, but you think about what a Gaia wine goes for now, it's like, you can't do it. And that's another subject there, the cost of wine and how that has affected, I think, what people think of as benchmark wines, and I have questions sometimes about young sommeliers, and I can say that now because I'm an old guy, about young sommeliers, about where are the benchmarks for them. Mm-hmm. I remember these great vintages, 82 and 85 and 88, 89, 90 in Italy, and Sassicaia, 88, I remember, oh my God, I'm not always sure that what we think of as a really good or great wine today is the same. I don't know if that's just the old person speaking or if that's a real thing. But in my heart of hearts, that's probably how I feel. It's like, I don't think it's not quite as good. Mm-hmm. It used to be a lot of fun. We could taste a lot. You could taste bad wine back then. We don't taste bad wine anymore. I mean, it's really rare. You taste wine that, I don't really like it, it's not very good. Mm-hmm. But you don't get to taste bad wine. You don't get to taste the stuff that's like, oh, that's a mistake. We don't even want to call a mistake or a failure anymore. So, but I won't. Anyway, so stop me if I'm going on too long. So I worked for Fabrizio for like 4 years or whatever. Went to Sardinia and with him and oh, it was great. And Providence, Rhode Island, Federal Hill. I mean, it was like Italian and Portuguese Mecca. The things that were available there and things that I hadn't seen since I was in Italy that you could get. So at Pizzico, and I'm sorry, this is an aside, he only hired people that were from Italy. Mm-hmm. And there was me and one other, there was a woman that worked for him that was not from Italy. And it was fun because there was a guy from Milan, there was a guy from Florence, there was a guy from Napoli, there was a guy from Sicily. And if it was you and me, in the waiter station or something talking, and the guy from Sicily would say, oh, Artie, Napoli, he's a criminal, Oh, he's an asshole, he's a criminal. And, and so like separately, it was like, oh, that guy's no good, he's awful. But yet, they all got along, it was great. And they used to speak in Italian all the time. And it goes, hell, after a while, because I didn't speak in Italian very much, I spoke food Italian. Mm-hmm. And after a while, you could tell when they were talking about you. Anyway, so it was a really, really fun experience, and it was fun to work in a very comfortable restaurant that just had fantastic food and whatever. After a few, I think it was about 4 or 5 years with him, and we're probably talking about it was 1994. I didn't feel at that point like I was going anywhere. I mean, I liked what I was doing, but I didn't feel like I was going where. I liked Rhode Island, but I wasn't, which is a very interesting state to live in. It's a lot of fun, but I didn't feel like I was going anywhere. And I was trying to decide what the next step was. My brother called me, and he was living in Anchorage, Alaska. And he was the general manager for Graybar, the electronics company up there. And he said, why don't you come up and stay with us for a while? And, it's just the timing was right. And so I put all my stuff in storage in Rhode Island and got on a plane and went up and stayed with my brother for about a year and his family. And I loved Alaska. It was eye-opening. It's a place where you realize that the environment is in control. You, even in living just outside of Anchorage and Eagle River, even living in the city, nature moves in pretty quickly. You know, I mean, a couple people get killed by moose every year downtown. You know, you hear very frequently, you know, people attacked by bears. You had to be real careful whenever you were hiking and whatever. I never ever caught fish as big as those salmon. There was a fantastic Japanese-run supermarket there that you could get fish like, you know, I don't think it would be like getting fish in Japan, but you know, it was maybe the next best thing. And it was just a fantastic market. There was, it was a really, really fun place, getting used to light that, you know, it was light in April and May until, well, not always. And then in the wintertime, it was dark, you know, except for about 3 or 4 hours in the daytime. I ended up getting a job at a place called Habitat that would have been sort of like a Williams-Sonoma type store, but much expanded. There were more household things like what you would do to organize your closet, shelving, all kinds of supplies. I mean, it was a very nice store, and I don't know if it's still there. But what was interesting was a lot of the native people from the interior would come in to Anchorage once or twice a year and essentially load up with supplies. And so my job there at Habitat was I did a lot of cooking demonstrations and stuff like that for them. And I did that for about a year. My sister lived and still lives in Vancouver, Washington. And I took a weekend or something like that it was like the perfect Oregon, Portland summer. So it must have been the summer of '95. And it was 80 degrees and sunny and clear. And it was just absolutely beautiful. And I thought, oh, this is it, you know. Anchorage and Alaska was just too far away from everything. I had friends up there, and you know, it was great living with my brother, but you know, it was too far away from everything. And so I moved down to Portland in '95 and got a job. Went back to waiting tables and got a job at Pozzo. And Pozzo at the time was, I'm not sure, but it had to be, if not the busiest, one of the 2 or 3 busiest restaurants, maybe in Oregon, I don't know. But I mean, it was busy. And it was a hot spot to be. You wanted to be at Portland and at Pozzo. And Dave Machado was the executive chef. And it was part of the Kimpton group, the hotel group. And so I started working for them. And after a few months, a gentleman that became my best friend, Darren Hamilton, he was sort of in the same boat that I was, doing the same thing. He had been in restaurant management up in Vancouver, BC, and up in Edmonton, Alberta. And he and his wife had moved down to Portland, and he was back waiting tables for a while. They wanted to hire another manager for Pozzo, and they hired Darren to be a manager. I think with the intention of him eventually becoming the general manager of the restaurant. And Darren and I had become friends, and he started trying to talk me into getting into restaurant management again. And about the last thing I wanted to do at that point was restaurant management. I spent half my life getting into it, and I spent about half my life getting out of it. I wanted to get out. There's too much hand-holding, too many moving parts. It's like, get me out of this, you know? And it's like, it never ending. And there's good sides to it too, and I love restaurants. And so finally, he wore me down, and I said, okay. I said, I'll do it, and I started going through the interview process with the Kempton Group and also with Dave Machado, who was ultimately the head guy. And Dave was from Fall River, Massachusetts. And, that's right next to Providence, and I lived in Massachusetts for a long time. So we had that in common, and I liked Dave and whatever, but Dave didn't want to hire me. And it took Darren, I think, a couple weeks to talk him into it. And I remember this very clearly. After my interview with Dave, I remember thinking, oh, I don't want to do this. I don't really want to do this at all. And Dave had changed his mind after the interview, and he did want to hire me. So it took a couple weeks for this to all work out. But the clincher was I was going to be able to manage and run the wine program at Pozzo, which was a very big wine program and a really big deal. John Dana, who was leaving, had been the person that put that program together originally, and he did just a fantastic job with a really broad selection of Oregon wine, a fantastic Italian selection, and a pretty big California selection. I know we had some French wine on there, but it wasn't a big part of it. So I got to do that, and that again was just an incredible educational experience for me. And being able to have all that money to spend and not coming out of my bank account. And I think we still do in this market. But at that time, there were just some unbelievably good distributors and wine salespeople that were around. I'm thinking of George Hessong from Lemma, Don Heisteman, Greg Zancanella, Karen Hinsdale she wasn't a salesperson, but I remember coming into a lot of contact with Karen and her influence, and Evald Mosler. They were just they got in trouble later, but because their company went up, but Kip Christensen from Traders Duvan. Just an incredible availability of wine, and people that knew their product. And I had run into that before in New York, in particular, and also in Virginia. There was a distributorship down there, but in New York in particular, there were some salespeople that just really knew their product. And I've always felt that I learned more about wine from really good salespeople. I'm probably wrong about this, but I always felt like I learned more from really good salespeople that knew their product, or from talking to a winemaker, than I ever did in any class or certification, Master of Wine or Master Sommelier that I talked to or sat through a discussion. And it's not that I dismiss what Master Sommeliers and Masters of Wine do. Maybe it's just the atmosphere that you're in. You're tasting these wines and you're talking to a guy, and a lot of these guys had been to the wineries and knew the winemakers or had selected the wines themselves. It was fantastic. It was really, really good. It was such an unbelievable learning experience, and being to taste so many wines in all of these jobs that I had. being able to taste all of these wines. I don't think it was until until the consulting end of my business got so big that I was not tasting as much wine as I used to, that I realized how fortunate I had been to be able to taste those things. So where was I? I was with salespeople, and that was the beginning of these relationships with distributors and suppliers and winemakers, some local wineries and winemakers. That was the beginning of those relationships, and learning who to go to when you needed help, when there were issues that came up. And that became really important later on in this career, my career in the broad sense of the word. And that kind of takes me back to the chart house a little, because I think it was that, treat people the way that you want to be treated thing. It kind of carries through. So I got to take over this program, and it was like, it was like this feast all the time, and I remember, I could. There was like a budget that I could take stuff home to try, and then you would get a lot of samples to try too. And I remember with Darren, my friend Darren, who's the manager there, along with me, we would, collect a bottle or two at a time, and then sometimes we'd have like 6 or 7 Barolos, and we'd have, at the time, well, it'd probably be nothing now, but 6 or 7 Barolos, we'd have $1,000 or $1,500 worth of wine there in 6 wines, which now would probably be like $7,000 or $8,000. And we'd taste through these things, and they were all from, iconic winemakers, and we learned a lot, and got to sort of developed an ability to remember stuff, which became important later on too. That somehow I managed to learn how to taste the same wine a couple years later, or a different vintage, and remember how it had changed or whatever. And I don't know how that happened, but it was interesting. So that was fun. I got to taste wines that I remember. The one wine from Gasparini, Capo di Stato, and there's hardly any writing on the label, and we're looking at it. I'm going, Garen, do you know what this is? And it was something that John Dana had bought years ago, and we tasted it, and it was just, mind expanding. It was just unbelievable. A Bordeaux type blend up from the Veneto, and it was great. And it was a wine that they had produced, and it had been served to de Gaulle at some dinner in France, and he thought it was a Bordeaux. And that was their big claim to fame. Well, we ended up selling more of that wine, I think, than anybody. I think, and it came through Lemon, if I'm not mistaken. But so it was lots of fun stuff like that. There was a real commitment to training, mandatory training for waiters. There was a lot of food and wine pairing, wine dinners, all that kind of thing. I was able to. So Pazzo had this wine list format that we had to deal with, and it was some sort of special printing that you had to do. And it took, once you updated your wine list, you had to send it to the special printer, and it took like 2 or 3 weeks to get the thing back. And I don't know why, but it was I probably have a copy of it somewhere, but it's very involved printing. It looked great, but the wine list was always out of date. So there were always vintages wrong. There were always, oh, we're out of this, and it just, it's not what you want. So I got permission to go ahead and change the format of the list into just a little booklet type of thing. And I decided on my own, and it fortunately it worked out okay, that I wanted to be able to pick out wines that I thought were really interesting or really unique, and I wanted to write a little blurb about them, just at the bottom, or kind of highlight them or something like that. And after a while, I decided that I wanted a voice. And so I started using this sort of tone that was like a little bit sarcastic. I tried to, for better or worse, infuse humor into it, and give a little bit of, if I could, and keep it short, a little bit of detail about maybe how it's made or whatever, and then maybe a little bit of a description, and leave it at that. And that what was interesting was that was fairly successful, and so I kind of started doing it more and more, and we did a lot of things like, I remember coming up with an idea, and it's not brilliant or anything, but setting the tables with a bottle of wine on it and stuff. And it was amazing how, to me, that these ideas were not anything new. They weren't even my ideas, but that it was just implementing the thing, and that people would respond to it, at least at that time. I don't know that it worked, but at the time it worked. And a lot of this was being in the right place at the right time. So that went great. I loved doing that wine program. I used to love to do these cooking classes with Dave Machado, who was a really good chef when he cooked. And we would, there was this area underneath the restaurant where we would do banquets and stuff sometimes, and Dave would do, and we'd have 30 or 40 people show up for these cooking classes, and Dave would cook, and they'd all get to eat a little bit of it. And Dave would have me come up with as many different wines for each food item to match them, and I would get to talk to people about the wine and why I picked this and whatever, and they would ask questions, and they could buy the wine. It was a whole deal, and I loved doing that. It was really, really fun for me, that interaction of, and I think a lot of people in the wine business feel this way, that maybe the best thing there is in the wine thing is opening a bottle of wine for someone that they've never had before, and you kind of see the light bulb go on. It's like, oh, this is really, really good. Especially when it's not something that is, like we used to have to deal with a lot, this really extracted, oak-driven stuff. But stuff that was higher acidity, that was a little more elegant and whatever, and you would see, oh yeah, it's pretty good. And that still is just so much fun to do. Dave Machado, after a while, left Pazzo to become the executive chef, or I can't remember, I think he became a vice president for the Heathman Group, which later became North Pacific Management. And they were taking, what was the name of the restaurant? Anyway, they were going to open South Park Seafood Grill and Wine Bar. I'm drawing a blank on what the restaurant was before it, but that restaurant had not really been successful. And then Dave was going to be in charge of the Heathman, and there are 4 or 5 restaurants at the Greenwood Inn. And they opened up the Heathman Lodge and over there in the restaurant in there. And Dave asked me, after he left, got in touch with me and asked if I wanted to come with him over to South Park and be a manager, wine person over at South Park, and that I could put the wine list together at South Park. And yes, yes, I would do that, because the plan was eventually I would be the wine director for the Heathman Group, and would have I would have the ultimate say over what was going on at the Heathman wine program, which was extensive. Ron Wolf had been doing that, and I believe he left, I think, just after Dave took over. And that's another story. But so anyway, this was the beginning of South Park, so this must have been in '97. And by that point, I had met my wife, Jenny, at the INPC that summer, at the INPC at Christum Vineyard. And she was a volunteer, and I was the sommelier for that day when they do their lunches, whatever. And I met this woman, and she had just started working for Dell Computers, and that evolved into a 24-year marriage so far. And so she was computer literate. I was, from computers in restaurants, yeah, they were in there a little bit in the early 90s. 95 really is when we started seeing them more and more. I kind of, I could get online and stuff, but I didn't know how to do a lot of stuff. Jenny did. And I had this idea for this wine program. Not all of it my idea, but a lot of it my idea, of putting together a wine list by style. I had read Fiona Beckett's book, Wines by Style. And I thought, and I still think, this is a good idea if you can make it work, if you can do it right. And I remember when I first got to Portland, there were 2 things that struck me. One was, well, there were a lot of things, 3, 4 things. I sound like something out of Monty Python. Yeah, the what do you call it? The Spanish Inquisition. There are 4, Anyway, so one of the things that struck me was the incredible Italian selection. I was also struck by how many wines were available that I had been used to dealing with out on the East Coast, from the south of France, from southern Italy, from Greece, Austria, Germany, and whatever. But there were all these wines out there, South Africa, Australia, that were out there that I would see in wine shops like Liner Nelson, or what was it? I would see them. It was the precursor to New Seasons. They had a grocery store. They were great grocery stores. There was one in Vancouver that I used to go to, and that later became New Seasons grew out of that. But they had a fantastic wine selection at this store, and it was all this stuff that I knew from the south of France in particular. But I would walk into restaurants up and down downtown in Portland, and all I would see, and to me it was a negative, all I would see was, if it wasn't Oregon, it was California. And that was it. And the other thing was, it was the same names over and over and over again at the time. And Not that there was anything wrong with the wines. That wasn't it. The point was, why are we limit? Well, I think it was so limiting, and it was like, if that's all you offer people, that's all they're going to buy, and that's going to make you think that that's what they want, that that's all they want. And I just thought that was just kind of goofy. But I also realized too that if you wanted to do something where you're going to have what at the time, and maybe still are, obscure wines or wines from obscure regions, you had to get the information out there. You had to make it accessible, and you had to make it easy for people to try stuff to see if they liked it or not. And so I had this idea that you could put this wine list together and do it by style. And I came up over time, and it evolved quite a bit of different headings, to be able to categorize wine for better or worse. And then I started coming up with some subcategories so you could, within a style, you could get sort of a new world, old world, or a modern style, traditional style breakdown. And so I had the idea, and I met with all of these great distributors who were anxious to get these wines out to restaurants. I think there were not very many restaurants working with them. I think Higgins had some stuff, so I kind of went crazy and put together this list. There were 125 bottles, and at the time, about 30 glass pour selections in 3 or 4 different portion sizes that you could get, tastes and whatever. And I started writing. We were going to put the menu on a 11 by 17 piece of paper at first. And it was great, except, it kind of came up between you and whoever you were sitting across from. Did the whites on one side and the reds on the other. And I started doing text boxes on the sides. And I was a big fan of Randall Graham. Big fan of his. He's the only guy I ever joined his wine club. And he was funny. He was so funny. And I tried to emulate him unsuccessfully, but I developed my own style. And I came up with this idea at the time too, that everybody was like the wine guy and the wine guru and all that. And I came up with the idea of Guy Duvin. And so I started using it because I would write stuff. We had blackboards, and I could write little blurbs about wines on blackboards, and they were all over the restaurant to get people to taste. And those were very, very effective. And on top of that, because nothing happens because of one person, we had just a fantastic bar staff. In particular, Will Prouty, who now has Division Wines. When I met Will, I don't think he would be mad at me for saying this. He didn't know anything about wine, but he was like a sponge. And he was so much fun to work with. I think he was the best bartender I ever worked with in my career. People loved him. And we had Shannon, and there was another girl that was really, really good at the bar. There was such a commitment to training at South Park, and there was a commitment to get information out there about wine. And we had a retail section up front. And I owe that all to Dave Machado, who really, I would never have been successful without Dave. In that he didn't really direct. Occasionally he would say, "Hey, Dave, don't spend so much money," but occasionally he would butt in, which I hated him for. But really, he gave me free rein, and you just don't get that very often. And we worked together for 25 years, and along with Darren Hamilton. And yeah, Dave, just fantastic. But one of the things that I'm proud of too is because of the commitment to training there were probably a half a dozen or more people that ended up getting into the wine business, either making wine. Naomi Smith is now like the regional supervisor or regional manager for Laurent Perrier Champagne Company. There were people that went to work for distributorships and whatever. You know, I think it was the time. I think it was a pretty exciting time in for wine in Oregon. People hadn't become jaded yet about wine. When I read some of the stuff that I wrote, it sounds pretty naive, a little embarrassing sometimes. Definitely had a point of view, which I'm not always, I'm not ashamed, but it's like, oh, Dave, you could have held back on that, you know. But it was fun. You know, I think people were anxious to learn. And during this whole time, I was learning, and have always felt that you get in trouble the minute you start thinking you know something, and that you need to always approach wine or maybe anything as a student, and that you're never above having some sense knocked into you and understanding. So South Park, for whatever reason, generated a lot of national press. We sold a lot of Oregon wine. We had a private label that we did with Lynn Penarash and Rex Hill that was very successful. We moved a ton of Oregon wine, but the Oregon wine producers never saw that. What they saw was too many imported wines. And it was I kind of resented that sometimes. It was like, come on, you know, we're selling a lot of Oregon wine and getting it in front of a lot of people, and I know that I was probably not held in the highest regard for a lot, but boy, I remember meeting so many wine producers, winemakers and stuff, and buying a lot, and it just, for whatever reason, it was invisible. Mm-hmm. It's but you know, whatever. We did a Meet the Winemaker series, I remember, where we had Clive Coates come in, and Roger Baumerick, and Annegret Ray Gardner from Kesselstadt, and then we had, I don't know, so many Oregon winemakers. We just come in and we would just have like a wine or two from the producer, and we would ask them to go around and just give a sample at the tables and stand and talk just for 5 minutes. That was very successful for selling wine and getting it out there. It was fun. I was forced many times to erase stuff that I had written on the blackboard. That was when Dave would interfere, and I said he just didn't understand. He didn't understand the creativity.
Tortured artist.
Yes, that was it. Just didn't get it. I remember having to take something down. I did something up at Christmas about baby cheeses that I paired, and that apparently didn't go over very well. But stupid stuff. So it garnered a lot of national attention, some local attention, but a lot of national attention. And we had a lot of articles written on us about the wine list from a lot of high-powered magazines. We won the, I don't think it's not around anymore, but we won the Monterey Wine Festival 2 years in a row for best short list in the country. And we won once for Laurel Kitchen, another Dave Machado restaurant, another year. And that was a big deal. Got a bunch of awards. I had started writing articles for, I don't even know if it's still around anymore, but for Santé magazine. Started writing a bunch of articles for them that got published, and so it was kind of a big deal. And I think there was, I hope Machado doesn't watch this, but I think that I think South Park struggled getting the food end of it, Mediterranean seafood and whatever, for a year or so. And I think the wine bar, because of the wine staff and because of Will and whatever, that really helped carry that restaurant over. And then they got Karen DiVincenzi in as a general manager, and she got that thing organized and whatever. One of the other things that happened, because because my career would have begun and ended at South Park if this hadn't happened. You remember I said that Dave had said that eventually the plan was for me to be out of restaurant management and be the wine director for the Heathman Group. So a lot of time went by, and I was getting frustrated because, honestly, I had my fill of restaurant management. And I just didn't enjoy it, and I knew it wasn't what I loved. And I remember sitting and talking to Jenny, and by this time I think she had left Dell Computers and she was working for Cisco Systems. So she was making more in a month than I made in 2 years, I think. So I remember talking with her, and I was really frustrated. And she said, "Well, you don't need to do it. Do something else." And I remember going and having a conversation with Dave and saying, "Hey, Dave, we talked about this, and we really, I want to do the other restaurant. I want to be involved in the Heathman Lodge and whatever." And I remember I essentially told him, if we can't work it out, then I'm going to leave. I'm done. And it's like the next day or the day after, I was done with restaurant management, and Dave had me start working on the other restaurants. And the first thing he did to get back at me, I think, so there was a lot of dead inventory at the Heathman Hotel. And there was a lot of stuff, it's like what I said before, if you have all these wines and nobody knows what they are, and I mean, people still do that today. They have all these obscure wines and they're okay, but if there's nobody there at the store to answer a question, or they're hesitant to come up to you and say, "Hey, what do you like, or what don't you like?" If you're not willing to do that, it's just not going to work. So my first job with the Heathman, and I was still doing South Park and the other restaurants, was I was supposed to get the Heathman inventory down to a certain dollar amount that I can't remember what that dollar amount was. But this was a horrible job. I mean, it was absolutely horrible. It's like choosing, who's your favorite child and sending the rest of them away. I mean, it was horrible. It was horrible, and it made everyone angry at the hotel. But that was the direction of the company, and it wasn't just Dave Machado's direction. This was a corporate decision. They had a great guy running as the CEO of the Heathman Group back then, Bruce Ferry, and a smart guy, and it was successful. But I know I made a lot of people were unhappy with me at doing that, but it needed to be done, and so we did it. Mm-hmm. Things got better after that, and fortunately, I was the director, so I didn't have to to deal with the day-to-day. And what that did by being that director like that is it sort of opened up eventually other opportunities. Going back to South Park for just a minute, the way that Guy Devan came about after using this voice at Pozzo and also using it at South Park is I said that we had things that we would put on the blackboard, and there was a guy. He eventually became he was a lawyer that worked for this big law firm here in Portland, and the lawyers would come into South Park all the time, and he was a white wine fanatic, and he used to like the stuff that I wrote, and he saw Guy Devan up there, and I remember the day he walked over to me and said, you need to trademark that. And I thought, who cares about that? But he said, no, you really need to do that. Somebody's going to take that from you. And for better or worse, he said, it's not that expensive. So we started working on a trademark for Guy Devan, which shouldn't have taken any time at all, but took like a year and a half or 2 years, because the trademark office or whatever, they couldn't wrap their heads around the idea that it was not a translation. And that apparently, and I may be getting this wrong, that you can't trademark a translation or something. And it took a long time to get through that it's not Guy Devan or anything, it's Guy Devan. Every French person I ever met got it immediately. English speaker always wanted to call me Guy. And there were a lot of people that still call me Guy or Guy. No, okay. So that happened, and got the trademark. Around 2000, Philippe Boulot, the chef, used to be at the Heathman, and I think he just retired not too long ago over at the athletic club, gave my name to, I think he was doing some consulting work for McCormick & Schmidt. And he gave my name to Saeed Mosani, who was the CEO, and Jeff Skeel, who was their chief operating officer or senior vice president or something like that. And Saeed called me up one day and said he wanted to meet. Okay, I don't know. So, at this point, all I've done is I've done a bunch of I've done some fairly large wine lists or been involved with big wine lists and stuff like that, but they're always for sort of individual units. And so McCormick & Schmidt at that time had 91 restaurants, and they were in 40 states. And they had 91 wine programs. Yeah. And okay, I need to say this properly. They understood that to be profitable in their wine programs, they needed to consolidate. They didn't need to have just one program, but they needed fewer than 91, get down to like 85 or something like that. So So me not knowing that this is more complicated than than I realized, yeah, I'll do it, sure. I'll do my best. And Dave Machado was really flexible in that he let me do that, and not be an employee, and be my own business. I started Guy de Van LLC after getting a trademark for the name, so I was a business. I got my business license for Portland and the whole deal, and started working on McCormick and Schmick as well as doing South Park and the Heathman Group. And that was an eye-opener. We started with the glass pour program, which I thought made sense. And we could, at the very least, get everybody, or almost everybody, on the same glass pour program, or at least 90% of the glass pour program. They also wanted to have a focus on, Pacific Northwest wine. And I learned that, and this was over time, I learned that I think this has changed, that at the time, when you got outside of the borders of the Pacific Northwest, that except for pockets, and this was a realization for me. I think you guys making wine in Oregon knew it long before, that there were pockets of interest, but there was no, oh no, we need to taste this Oregon Pinot Noir or whatever. And that interest dropped off really quickly. So anyway, I'm trying to remember how many wine lists we cut this down to, but it was probably 6. Some states you had to do individually, like Pennsylvania. I remember it was a miserable place, and the pricing was, you paid the same retail as you did wholesale. It was just ridiculous. But I remember doing the glass. This was so eye-opening for me. And I asked people to help me with this, help me taste through wine. So I'm putting together a glass pour program that we could get in 90% of the restaurants, and some version of it on the others. And so we're tasting wine, and at the time we're tasting at the low end where McCormick and Schmick wanted to be. We're tasting wines that would have cost the company $4 to $6 a bottle. So you got to think about how times have changed, but $4 to $6 a bottle. But even so, you're thinking the quality at that level is pretty. The wines aren't bad. They're just okay. And so I had Darren helping me one day, and I had a couple other people helping me taste through wines, and that's like case after case after case of wine that we're going through, of the Chardonnays and the Pinot Noirs and whatever. And I remember this was enlightening because it turned into a really long-term relationship with all of the companies I ever ended up working with. Saint Michel, thank you. With Saint Michel. And so we were doing all these glass pour wines blind. And it was so consistent that Saint Michel products, and obviously we weren't tasting Pinot Noir at that point with them, but the Saint Michel products would come in 1, 2, or 3 consistently. And so I decided, well, there you go. What does that show you? And it wasn't just me ranking them. It's like the people that were helping me. And that showed me. And so that turned into a really long relationship, and one that I was really proud of. They were very good to work with, really helpful, and they had the distribution and all that. And distribution was one of the that was the bane of my existence, because you could, every state, well, it got better as there was more consolidation. It got better at least in terms of not having to talk to 30 different distributors in a state to get somebody to carry something. But it was a lot of work. And my job was to create these spreadsheets that could be sent out to all the restaurants, and that they were to follow. And then I had to follow up with Jeff Skeel. You need to make sure your guys are complying, because I'm going to get calls from the supplier saying, hey, this restaurant isn't buying the wine. And it's that sort of a job. And and that's what my job became eventually for most of it, was putting stuff like that together, figuring out pricing. How do you come up with a plan for a company that's in that many states and have pricing that works, both for the company and for the customer? And what's the plan for that? And it was fun, and I realized that I really enjoyed that part of it too. And I still got to taste all kinds of wine. It was definitely wine that was not as individualistic or as handmade. It was sometimes more commercial. But my goal had always been with a company like McCormick and Schmidt was to make sure that we weren't just offering all the same old names, and that they still had customers like me or like you that would come in that maybe wanted something that wasn't out of a great big single tank out of the Central Valley, and that they could find something that they could order for themselves or for their guests and still hold their head up, and it was still interesting. And so that was always a goal. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not, but it was fun, and it was a tremendous amount of work at first. It became easier as I grew into the job, and as I learned. Again, who were the national salespeople are a whole different thing than local, and they're on a different level of understanding. Some of them are absolutely great. Some of them, my dog could do a better job. But it's a whole different way of doing business. And it can be fun. It was a lot of fun. I remember this would happen 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. Somebody from Delaware or Maryland would call me and say, "Hey, it's like 8 o'clock out there, or 9 o'clock, and I'm out of such and such, and it's Friday. Can you get wine to me?" And I mean, if you're lucky, it was a wine that we maybe had a really good relationship with the person, and you eventually you get everybody's home number, and you give them a call and you apologize and say, "I'm sorry to bother you, but can we get your distributor to get a case to them?" And that was a big part of my life too. That I don't miss that part. I don't understand that thinking, Hey, call me at 1 o'clock your time. I could do something. On the other hand, this was for a different company, which I'm getting to, but for Restaurants Unlimited, I remember there is an importer, Aquitaine Wine Company, that I met through McCormick and Schmidt. They were Jean-Philippe, or Jean Calvet. Family's been in the wine business for 500 years and buys Bordeaux. He sells it all around the world. He was the head of, I can't remember, one of the great big companies down in Brazil when he worked for. He's an amazing, and his wife. They have a house. Their house in Bordeaux was designed by Eiffel. Yeah, stayed there a couple times. But anyway, and I do not mean to overstate my influence on this, but they were trying to get into the Oregon market, and they had their distributor was Columbia Distributing at the time, I think. And they showed me all these wines from Bordeaux, and they were for Bordeaux really moderately priced, and the quality was exceptional. They were perfect Bordeaux restaurant wines. So you could drink them now. They'd improve, but they were meant to be drunk fairly soon. They weren't simple or anything. He had the high end too if he wanted it. But he had these wines, and I fell in love with them. They were great. And I got them on the McCormick and Schmidt program. And I got them to get a glass pour program, a glass pour wine on it. So that meant they had an entree into 40 states. And so we developed a really strong relationship, and I always made a point to make sure that they were on a program in some form, maybe not always a glass pour, but they were always on a list somewhere. There was one time with RUI, we were rolling out an update of the program, and I believe it was the restaurant, one of the restaurants or two of the restaurants down in LA had not received a glass pour. And RUI was always big. It's got to be ready to go. There's no halfway thing here. It's got to be ready to go. It's complete, and it rolls out without a problem. And so I found out like a day or two before that the stuff had been delayed coming out of France and was still on the ship. And I called him over in Bordeaux, and I called him, I told him the problem. He put 2 pallets of the glass pour wine on a plane and flew them over. So that took out, I realized that took out his profitability for anything that was on that program for at least a year, maybe longer. And I thought, okay, that is like so far above and beyond the call of duty. I think the world of him. That was great. He was fantastic. Anyway, so what else can I tell you? I know I didn't realize I had done all this stuff, so I forgot about it. I'm enjoying remembering this actually. So we developed, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 different programs for McCormick and Schmidt, and that turned into, I don't know, 10 or 12 year relationship. And that brings up another point that has been great for me, and that was that everybody that I've worked for has been a long-term relationship. And with RUI, it was like 14 years, and Dave Machado, it's been 25 years. McCormick and Schmidt, long-term. Even the shorter-term ones, like for Bruce Carey restaurants, that was like 4 or 5 years. And Romano's Macaroni Grill, talk about commercial wine. That was like 3 or 4 years before that company was sold. So that's really helpful because when you own your own business and you're really small and you have a maximum of 3 employees, usually just 2, you wake up every day hoping somebody's not going to call and say, hey, Dave, we've decided we're going to move this back internally to do it. So you've got to keep giving people a reason to keep you employed. So, and speaking of Bruce Carey, he got in touch with me in 2003 to do Blue Hour's program. And that eventually led to doing the rest of his 23 Hoyt and Saucebox and Clark Lewis. And that was interesting, working in particular with Kenny Giambalvo, the chef, who was really good. We did a lot of wine dinners and food pairing, things like that. It was a small program. I tried to do the same thing, not by style, but I did that regionally. But I still used text boxes. And Bruce had a real commitment to training in the restaurants as well. I think that my biggest struggle with Blue Hour was, and those restaurants, was again trying to get people out of what I always felt was like a wine rut, and label drinkers, and I guess there's nothing wrong with that, I guess, really, but it just kind of gets old. And you've got an innovative chef with an innovative menu, and why fall back on the same stuff all the time? So during all this time, I started traveling to wine regions a lot. And one of the most important things that I felt, and I felt it was, and it became important, even more important later on, because it landed me another consulting job, was when you're doing consulting and you're choosing wines for a wine program, you need to keep your integrity, and it's unbelievable how much stuff people offer you, some of which is hard to resist. I never had a problem if somebody wanted to take me out for dinner, because I figured dinner, I can cover that if I need to. But wine, trips, somebody once offered to take me to the big golf thing in Georgia, the Masters, on a private jet, and that was my first meeting. And you have to have some kind of integrity, and I want to be careful how I say this. There were companies that I worked with where that was an issue, and was sometimes the reason that they wanted to hire an outside person. And one of the drawbacks of doing wine programs in-house is exactly that it becomes sort of proprietary, and all of the goodies end up in one person's lap, and it becomes unclear why certain choices and decisions are made. So that was something that I really tried to do. I will admit that I did I never did anything with trips. Sometimes there was no way I was ever going to get to Patagonia on my own. There was no way I was ever going to get to South Africa or somewhere on my own. And okay, I felt like I could justify something like that, but the rest of it, not so much. I was always careful never to accept a trip from somebody that I hadn't been doing business with for a significant period of time. That they were already established, firmly established with the company. There was no way that anything that they had on the program was ever going to be deleted from the program in the medium term or long term. So that was an issue too, and that's a real problem, I think, throughout the wine industry still. Anyway, with Blue Hour, so then around 2005, I got this call from a guy named Dave Johnson, and he worked for RUI. I can't remember exactly. I think he was in charge of all the buying for the company. Not only wine, but food and stuff too. And he gave me a call. They apparently, RUI, which had been in business for a long time, had a consultant that lived up in Seattle that was retiring or passed away or something like that. And they were looking for another person to help them. So keep in mind, I'm doing South Park and all of those restaurants. I'm doing Blue Hour and all of those restaurants. I'm doing all of McCormick and Schmidt. I'm writing articles. And it's just me and sometimes Jenny, because Jenny worked with me for about 10 years because she left Cisco Systems after a while and worked for Guide Event. And then we had another person who's great. Matter of fact, she's going to have her wedding in our backyard here this August. And Jenny's going to be the
officiant.
Yes, and so that'll be fun. But and she worked with us as sort of my virtual assistant. So I'm doing all this stuff, and then I get this call from RUI, and their flagship restaurant was Palisade up in Seattle, and it was a huge program. High-profile restaurant, right on Elliott Bay, beautiful place. You know, there's a river running through it, and fish and whatever. And you know, again, it's a corporate restaurant, but it's a big place, and a wine list that has a lot of good selections on it, but is really not really well organized. You know, it needed to be shaped. Didn't need more stuff added to it. Well, maybe a little bit, but it needed better organization. And RUI hired me to do that. So there was another opportunity to make a lot of enemies with people that had been doing it before, with the managers and all that, because here's this outside guy that doesn't really know the company that well and whatever. And so, you know, you need to learn to pick your battles and decide what's important and what's not important. And I thought it was just a one-off. I thought it was a one-off job, so it took a couple months to go through it and do the training. They were putting in a really new high-end menu in there. I remember we were doing a menu tasting, and they had crab legs. They were from the North Sea or something like that. And I swear to God, they were this big around. I never had anything like that. They were fantastic. They were great. Which reminds me, one of the best things I ever ate was in Chile. I was with Wines of Chile, and I can't remember what winery we were at, but we were outside, and there's this pavilion there, and there's this little old lady, and she's got this little dish of, they looked like potatoes that were incredibly thin and fine, but were crispy and fried, sitting in some sort of olive oil or something. So I'm eating them, and they're one of the best things I've ever eaten. And I asked her, in my poor Spanish, what are these? They're little river eels. Beautiful. And then I look at them, and you can see their little eyes and everything. It was great. They're so good. They were so good. I bought some. They would sell them in a jar in the grocery store, and I brought some home. Anyway, I'm sorry, that was a sideline. So I thought this was a one-off job with RUI. And in the meantime, the guy that had originally called me, Dave Johnson, left the company. And there was another young guy that came in, James Miller, who eventually became the vice president of the company, and who I worked with for almost 14 years with him. And he was in charge of all purchasing, and he was the person that actually hired me to do all of RUI. And RUI had, at that time, I think about 40 restaurants, and they were in 20 states, I think. Naturally, all different states than what McCormick and Schmidt was in, because that would have made it easier. But RUI had, I think it was 11 different concepts. So there was Palisade, there was Portland City Grill, and then you had Kincaid's, Palomino, Stanford's. On the low end, Newport Bay, you had a takeout place called Fondi. And then they had one-off little restaurants, Maggie's and whatever. And RUI had a core program that wasn't really strictly enforced at all up until I came on board. James Miller recognized that we need to have the same thing in all the restaurants. So the issue with RUI was that in some restaurants there might be 10 cases of some great Bordeaux that's been sitting there for 5 years or 6 years that hasn't moved for 5 or 6 years. And in another restaurant, same company, same concept, that manager is buying glass pour wine that is on closeout that the distributor should be ashamed of selling because it's past, it's no good. It's not even good for cooking wine. So that was the issue there, and learning where everything was in these restaurants. How do you do this without just blowing it up? You know, how do you do this so it's a fairly smooth transition? I loved working with RUI. I've never worked for a company where it seemed like from the general manager to the guy washing dishes to the host or hostess, man, they were just really professional and kind, and I loved working with James Miller. They made me their partner of the year one year. It was, just a guy. Well, they had all these big companies. It was okay. I loved working with them. They were a lot of fun. We even started this program for people at their main office in Seattle, and where I would bring in 5 or 6 wines. And sometimes I'd bring them out of my own cellar, and there would be maybe 20, 25 people around the table, and we would just do wine tasting with them to get them involved. I think James Miller commitment, his commitment to getting everybody involved and training and I never felt more backed up and support from a company when we would need to implement something or make somebody do something, buy something, and put it on the list, as I did with that company and James Miller. And that is such a that just really helps you do your job. Consulting like that. I did a lot of menu analysis for them and comparison with other competitors and within their company as well. Lots of programs where they would do, Wine Down Wednesdays, where they would give discounts on wine and whatever. trying to figure out if this was profitable or if it was killing them, and it was killing them. But it was always interesting, sometimes frustrating, but always interesting. Distributors in Hawaii became the bane of my existence. They were really difficult, and when you ran out of something, it was good luck, because it's 2 weeks, sometimes 3, to get something back in. But boy, I can't say enough good things about that company. I hated to see them. I hated to see them go when that company got sold and bought. And the company that bought them, I think that company bought Chart House too eventually, and it just sucks the life out of everything. That's just me, but they become indistinguishable from anybody else. And you need that something that makes you unique. Okay. So in 2004, Machado opens Loro Kitchen out near where Will has his wine shop there. And Loro Kitchen, to me, was sort of a Mediterranean food, but not seafood like South Park was, not Mediterranean seafood, but it was Mediterranean flavors, and also and Portuguese, and Darren Hamilton, was a partner in that with Dave, and I still think that Loro Kitchen was the perfect neighborhood restaurant, maybe the most perfect neighborhood restaurant I'd been in. Fun wine list. It was short, but it was we won the Monterey Wine Festival that one year and got a couple of awards from magazines on stuff like that, which was great. Dave was doing some of the cooking then, and he had 2 people cooking with him that were really good. It was just a fun place to be, and there was a line out the door for years. Really, really good. I don't know exactly what happened between Dave and Darren, but that kind of fell apart after a few years. In the meantime, Dave also opened Vindaloo, which was an Indian restaurant, not too far away from Loro Kitchen. And Vindaloo was another incredible educational experience for me, to find wines because we always wanted to have wines that went with the food, but to find wines that actually went with Indian food. And so I didn't know much about Indian food and did a bunch of reading. They went up to Vancouver and went to some great restaurants up there. And I started looking for wines that actually worked. And in all my reading, everybody was talking about Gewürztraminer and Riesling and stuff like that. And so when I sat down with our menu items when we were tasting them, and I was bringing in some of these wines that had been recommended, I thought, what are you talking about? I mean, this doesn't work. And what we learned through trial and error was that, and I mean, it was a great, because it's a undervalued wine around in the U.S., it was Chenin Blanc. And it's Chenin Blanc with a little bit of sweetness to it. Really, really worked well. And so we had that. That Syrah could be really good, especially from the Northern Rhone, where it was a little more structured. Riesling with a little bit of, as long as you had a little bit of sweetness to it, would work. So there were Gruner Veltliner, another one that worked. Of course, Gruner Veltliner, you pick the odd thing that you want to eat, and probably Gruner Veltliner will go with it. So we did that, and I loved the food at Vindaloo. It was great. It was great. Very short list. I think we maybe had if we had 20 wines on that list, I'm overstating it. But it was a great learning experience, doing both of those restaurants. And then Dave closed down Lauro, and then he sold Lauro and sold Vindaloo after a few years. And I think it was in 2008, 2009. He called Darren, and then later on he called me because he had found this space sort of a little bit north of downtown, and it became Nel Centro. In 2009, opened up, and Nel Centro was, from Nice. The food was from Nice down to Genoa, so Liguria and whatever. And so, one thing Dave's always good at is doing food history and where foods come from, and what are people eating historically and stuff like that. And that inspired me over the years to sort of do the same thing. And so I started looking at wines that maybe one way or another might have passed through that area or came from that area. So naturally you would want to do a lot of Ligurian wines, which at the time there were like maybe 3 in town, so. But then you also realize that, okay, historically there's the House of Savoy, there's Lombardy, there's southeastern France and Provence, and that whole thing. So there actually turned out to be a lot of wines that you could get from that area. But we also wanted to have a really strong Pacific Northwest and Oregon section. And so on one side of the menu, we had white wines that were wines from that area, and then we had a whole section at the bottom that was from Oregon and the Pacific Northwest. And then on the back, we had the red wines from Liguria and whatever, and then we had a pretty big Oregon selection of red wines and a couple things from Washington, but mostly it was from Oregon. We always had a couple of Oregon Pinot Noir glass pours, always, when available, a rosé from Oregon, and filled it out that way. Big selection of dessert wines and stuff, and really a fun restaurant. Struggled for a while. Darren didn't come on board right away. I think the restaurant struggled at first for about a year, and again, not to overstate my influence, but I feel like I was essential in getting Dave and Darren back together to work together, and Darren came in and really turned that restaurant around, and did a great job. 2015, Dave opens Altabira, which is really a beer-focused restaurant. Was up at the top of that hotel, and incredibly successful. Really dependent on basketball games and events going on, but really a successful restaurant. That was where I had to learn about beer, because they put me in charge of both beer and wine. And the wine list, I just did whatever I liked, I put on there, because the focus was on beer. And we had 20 taps, and started out with a pretty extensive bottle selection, and we quickly realized after a few months that people were drinking the tap beer, and that was fun. Beer is beer. I felt like there were it's a formula, and not everybody's as successful at following it. I felt, and I'll probably get a lot of enemies for this. I felt like I tasted an awful lot of people's mistakes. and that you had people that maybe could produce like 10 barrels of beer or something like that, really small. And sometimes they'd make something that was great, and other times it was like, what are you doing here? What is this? And I felt like I felt like I tasted a lot of mistakes, and that a lot of mistakes got sold to people because the beer was so far ahead of wine when it came to packaging and labeling and keeping things going, getting the word out. They're really good at that. And the problem with beer is that if you have stuff in a bottle or in a can, it eventually goes on you. I mean, with wine, a lot of times you have years. With beer, you got a while, but that was fun. And then finally, we opened up Tanner Creek Tavern, and Tanner Creek was it was a tavern food, sandwiches, things like that. Fun menu, maybe never as clearly defined as the other restaurants. In a part of the Pearl that I think had not, was still being constructed. And there I did something, Dave let me do something that I'd always wanted to do. So besides having our Oregon wines, it was all Southern Hemisphere wines. And I'm a huge fan of wines from the Southern Hemisphere, particularly, I'll say it out loud, I love Australia, especially Western Australia and Yarra Valley. I think Australia is fantastic, always completely overlooked in our market. And there are so many fantastic wines. They did it to themselves, Australians, back when they were, just mass producing cheap wine and whatever. But there's so many great wines there. New Zealand, Tasmania, but Western Australia, if you ever get a chance to go, I absolutely love it. And then Chile. I mean, Chile is like just a fantastic place. If I was, and I've told my wife, if I was 20 years old again, I would get on a plane and go to Buenos Aires and stay in Argentina for like 5 or 6 years. And I was really surprised at what a vibrant town Mendoza is. And how a person definitely needs to go and see people tango. And I'm serious. You need to go see people that know how to tango, because it is unbelievable to watch them. It's just beautiful. It's also, I mean, it's incredibly sexy. It's these elegant people dancing. And I'm going to say this in the same breath. One of the other most incredible things I ever saw, it was in Chile. I think it was the first time I ever went to Chile. I was at a winery, and the guy raised racehorses. And he brought out, this is years ago, I mean, this is 15, going on 20 years ago, brought out this racehorse that I'd never been close to a thoroughbred before. Why am I telling you this story? I'd never been near a thoroughbred before. And it was like some $5 million horse that he paid for. I have never seen an animal like that. I mean, it was like, it took your breath away. It was so beautiful, and you could just see that thing. It wasn't even moving. He looked like he was going 50 miles an hour. Okay, sorry. I'm sorry. I think that's everybody. I have done. There were a few one-off consulting gigs that I did. Grand America Hotels in Salt Lake. Just did a little bit of work for them. I did, and I am so glad I did this. I did just hardly anything, but I did a little bit of work for Old Spaghetti Factory. And I got to meet Chris Hine. And Chris Hine has become a really good friend. And he is, and I think with a lot of people, maybe just about half the world's favorite person. You know, he is just a great individual. Yeah, so I never, once I got to be friends with him, I didn't care that they never hired me after that. It didn't matter. I just like him. So, but so that's where we are. So then, you know, I had never planned really on retiring. I thought, well, I'll keep going. And I was still doing Dave's Restaurants and doing a little bit of work, but I had, you know, we were looking for another house, getting ready to slow down. And then the pandemic hit, and Dave ended up deciding to close his restaurants, and I continued to work a little bit. I worked with the company in Bordeaux for a little bit, and then we found this house, and I decided to retire, I guess, about 2 years ago. So that's where we are. Now it's all about kayaking, cooking. Our neighbors across the street, she is a unbelievable cook, chef, and so we have a little competition. And we love it here. Love it here. It's I don't really miss Portland. I miss the wine business. You know, if the right thing came along, yeah, I would do it. But you know, now it's travel and cooking and kayaking, working around the house, doing stuff like that.
Competing with your neighbors.
Yeah. You know, in all honesty, we probably have, in 2 years, we've probably interacted more and have more neighbors, friends, in 2 years than we did in 22 years living in Selwood, which is hard to believe. It's tough to find a good restaurant. There's a couple. Wine shops, you know, there are a couple places around. There's Brut up in Astoria. I love Astoria. Funky little town, but there's a lot going on. I love it. Scandinavian Festival this weekend. That's why we got the Danish flag out there. But you know, in some ways, you know, I think the coast has always been difficult for wine. I see the problem sometimes where people try to be adventurous with their selections, and they're just not. They're not telling people about them. You know, they're not getting. Why do I have this on the list? And then there's a lot. You know, there are some places. What fresh foods down in Cannon Beach has a big selection. It's okay, but you know, you can always find something, but it's hard. I end up going into Portland if I'm really looking for something. Portland's an incredible market for Italian wine. It really is.
That's quite a story.
I'm sorry that it's so long.
No, that is a true oral history right there, and I did almost nothing. A couple questions to wrap it up. I think you pretty much answered everything I want to answer, but I am curious about your. Obviously, you mentioned you knew Oregon wine well before you got here. You'd met Ponzi and Erath and some of those guys. What are the changes to Oregon wine? How has Oregon wine industry changed, and where is it going?
Well, it's gotten so much more consistently better. I think the biggest change, and I could be wrong about this, I think the thing that I'm most excited about with Oregon is what people are doing with Chardonnay now. Chardonnay is like, okay, in my mind, in my limited understanding of this, I think Chardonnay, if it hasn't already, can surpass Pinot Noir here. Walter Scott, I think. That's pretty good. There's always been John Paul over at Cameron. I mean, a fantastic wine. Yeah, I mean, there are some people that doing that. I think it's fantastic. I think a couple things. The first Oregon wine I ever bought for a restaurant was in New York. And so this is back in like 1980. Sokolblosser Pinot Noir. I bought it because it was from Oregon. What the hell is that? I don't know. And then when I was up in Rhode Island, it was a very limited selection. It was Willamette Valley Vineyards and Domaine Drouhin were the big ones. That was really what you could get, and that's about 19. That has to be like 1990, somewhere in there. So not that long ago. So when I got here, I felt, there was still a real lot of vintage variation. I remember people being really focused on vintage in that vertical understanding of wine, where you're more interested in the differences than the attributes of something. And what's wrong with it, rather than how is this similar or different from something else. And I think the wines were inconsistent back then. I remember them. John Paul's wines have always been good from the beginning. Christum was another producer that I loved. Russ Ranney at Evesham Wood, that was my guy for a while for Oregon wine. I loved the wines that he made, and he was like the nicest guy in the world. He just died a couple of years ago, didn't he? Yeah. Russ Ranney, he was fantastic. And those were my benchmarks. So the things that have changed that I think really are good and important, Oregon wine or Oregon Pinot Noir. I mean, it's world-class wine now. It competes with the best. I'm glad that people have, I think they have, stopped comparing themselves to Burgundy. That was never going anywhere, I don't think. Why do that? Talk about what you do. What makes your wine great. But two things. One, I'm really glad that Southern Oregon is getting more attention. I remember judging down there years ago. It was interesting, but there were people doing interesting stuff. Brandberg was really good, and now I taste things from Southern Oregon. It's pretty good, And the other thing is up along the gorge. I think they're doing really interesting work up there, and different grapes. That some of the other grapes are getting some attention besides Pinot Noir. How is Pinot Noir going to change in Oregon as things get warmer and warmer? And is it cool climate anymore? I don't know. I don't know. But I remember, a few years ago. It was years ago. I remember there was I was kind of on. I was asked to be on this Oregon Wine Board thing for some meetings, and there was big conflict between. It was changing the percentages of what could go into a wine and call it a varietal. And I remember this conflict between, particularly as you got out to the Oregon side of Columbia Gorge there, and really needing to have those numbers change, and the resistance from the Willamette Valley. And I understand both sides, but I'm glad it changed a little bit, It's It's really good. So I think that's good for people to be experimenting more. Just thinking off the top of my head, another thing that's changed. You can actually find places to eat and stay in the Willamette Valley. We are a real wine destination now in terms of visitors coming. And that's really important too, because we really need that. You know, one thing that I didn't talk about is we did retail online for Guy Devan, not too long after we formed the company. And at first we licensed our house and shipped out of our house. And we formed wine clubs, and we had 3 wine clubs at 3 different price points. And then it got big enough that we couldn't operate out of the house anymore, and so we got a place over in John's Landing. And we didn't want people to come in. It was just a place where we could ship. But we set it up so that people could come in if they wanted to, and I kept a very limited inventory, not more than $10,000 worth of wine. And there was space there where we could do wine tastings and teach classes, and that's where I would meet with distributors and stuff. Mm-hmm. And it got pretty successful. You know, Jenny was working for me at that point, and she was the one really responsible for that, for the growth of that. All I did was pick the wines and write them up and teach the classes and stuff like that. But Jenny was the personality. We delivered in Portland, and but we learned pretty quickly, and we did that for a few years, that it was 3 times the work for a third of the money, because of Oregon being a bottle state. Doesn't work. And shipping became a nightmare, where there were plenty of places to ship to. We had Illinois was a good state for us, West Virginia, because people from the other states would go to Martinburg and pick their wine up. California and Washington, and parts of Texas, and then it just you couldn't ship. It just became stupid. Mm-hmm. So we shut that down, and fortunately the consulting grew. But to get back to Oregon wine, I don't know. You know, we drink it. I open it up for our neighbors and whatever all the time, and it's pretty good. You know, I have my favorite people, and we drink that. There's a lot of wineries out there. What are there, like 700, 800 wineries in Oregon?
Over 1,000.
Is it over 1,000? That shows you where I've been for 2 years. So, I don't know. I assume that it will continue to grow. What's always worried me about Oregon, and I understand why they do it, is pricing. It's expensive, understandably, but sometimes it doesn't need to be. I've always felt some people have an inflated sense of what their product might be worth. But, you know, if you can get the money for it, okay, go ahead. It's okay. I wonder where the money comes from sometimes, you know, to do all this stuff. And that the market would begin to self-limit. I go into some of the wine shops and I see the prices on wines that I do remember being affordable, and I see them, you know, where, okay, I know I'm buying a high-end wine here at $85 or $90 or $100 a bottle, but I see those same wines now at $200 and $300 a bottle, and I always wonder. I guess there's a lot of money around, but you know, but I feel like I already said it, and I don't want to repeat myself, but I do worry about sommeliers and wine buyers, and being able to taste really, really good, really important wines from important producers and benchmark producers, and not having those to compare things to, I think is a potential problem, if it's not a problem already. And I also worry, another thing that worries me about the industry, there's a lot of things that worry me about the industry in general. And that is the paper chase, the certification thing. I know that I was, I got into it for a while, but it had almost no relevancy for what I did or for what I was doing. And I think what has relevancy is talking to people that know something, talking to the distributor or the salesman if they're good, reading. I tune in every week to Wine Scholar Guild. I did their French Wine Scholar thing and the whole deal. There's so much that's interesting about wine. I don't really know that. If you approach it like a scholar, and you want to have an academic approach to wine, yes, you need that. You want to get your master's of wine. I got my master's degree in history. I see the value there. I see the value for a big company that wants to have somebody working for them that has MW after name, because it's automatic credibility for sure. But in the ultimate scheme of things, wine is, besides being this beautiful, wonderful thing that takes you into another dimension almost sometimes when it's really, really good and life-altering and whatever you want to say about it, and romantic, quote Terry Thies in your articles and stuff like that. But it's a business, and you can be the greatest winemaker in the world, and if you're not selling your product, or you're making a product that the market's too small, well, it doesn't work. And so there's got to be some sort of balance in there. And I guess I still believe that I like the guys that kind of came up through the ranks. Maybe it's because that's what I did. And worked in restaurants, or worked in, like Peter Liam, worked in all these places, wine shops, tasted a lot of wine, had a lot of experiences with people. I'll take their opinion. You can keep the rest. I'm sorry, I take it all back.
Can't take it all back now. Well, that is all the questions that I have for you. I think you answered more than I even would have thought to ask.
Unfortunately for you, yeah.
Thank you so much for your time, for sharing your space with us, sharing your story with us and your opinions and all of that. We'll go ahead and let you off the hook. Thank you.
Thank you.